Good evening and welcome to our audience at the Shaker Heights High School tonight, as well as our live stream audience. Tonight's presentation is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, and especially its chapters in Cleveland Heights, University Heights, and Shaker Heights. My name is Catherine LaCroix. The League is a 104-year-old organization, nonpartisan organization focused on voter registration, voter education, and advocacy for voter rights. So we're serving two of those functions tonight, education and advocacy, because tonight we're talking about the impact of gerrymandering in Ohio, specifically in the context of its effect on public education in our state. So first, a little background. There are many definitions of gerrymandering. The simplest one is the drawing of district lines in a way that gives unfair advantage to a particular party or candidate. I like this dictionary.com definition simply because it explains gerrymandering in very few words, including the mechanism of gerrymandering, the dividing of a state, county, or other district into election districts so as to give one political party a majority in many districts while concentrating the voting strength of the other party into as few districts as possible. And that's what we have in Ohio today. But why should we care? That's the question we're discussing tonight. So here's our agenda. I will introduce the panelists. Our first speaker will give us some basic background about gerrymandering and the legislative process in Ohio. And then we will turn to how our state legislature, the General Assembly, has handled issues of public education in the past few years. After presentations by our panelists, we will have plenty of time for questions. Anyone and everyone may submit questions. Some housekeeping. If you're here in person, please write your question on an index card and pass it to the volunteers. Our live stream audience may submit questions through the Q&A function, please not the chat function, on your screen. In posing your questions, please support engagement that is civil and constructive. This is a place for learning. We welcome your own personal experience. Please avoid generalizations. We'll try to conclude all the questions that we can with a goal of completing the forum by 8:30. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Jocelyn Rosnick is Policy Director for the ACLU of Ohio. She serves as an adjunct professor at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences of Case Western Reserve University. She joined the ACLU of Ohio staff in 2012 and has worked on a range of civil rights issues. As Policy Director, she oversees the ACLU of Ohio's legislative, administrative agency, and public education advocacy efforts. Anthony Calderone has been superintendent since 2011 of the LaBrae School District near the city of Warren, following years as a high school principal and a teacher in that region. He holds a master's degree from Youngstown State University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Mount Union. During his years as superintendent, he has lobbied for the Fair Schools Funding Plan, a bipartisan proposal to bring Ohio finally into compliance with court rulings that Ohio's public school funding is unconstitutional. Dan Heintz serves on the Cleveland Heights University Heights School Board, as well as the steering committee for the Vouchers Hurt Ohio litigation. He is a teacher in the Chardon public schools. A product of Cleveland Heights Public Schools, he earned his bachelor's degree at John Carroll University and a master's at Ursuline College. So with that, Jocelyn, could you start us off by sharing some essential information about gerrymandering, how it works, and its impact on the legislative process?
I would be happy to. Everyone, just let me know if you can hear me okay in the back. Perfect. So I think the best way to talk about what's happening right now and how to change it moving forward is to look a little bit in the rear view mirror. So we're going to table set just for a couple of minutes. Unfortunately, I'm sure many of you already know, but gerrymandering is almost tradition in the Buckeye State. We have been heavily gerrymandered for years and years and years. But I'm going to look at just the last decade or two. So everybody knows that every 10 years we participate in the census. And the whole point of that is to take a look at the population because we know that they ebb and flow and change over time. And we take that census data and it's used to redraw our district sizes and boundaries. And this is actually required by the Constitution. John Adams said that the whole point of the redraw was to make sure that the districts were a portrait in miniature of the entire population at large, that districts should think, feel, react, act like the population as a whole. Now, while gerrymandering has been an issue for a long time, again, the more recent history is quite fascinating. We are not here to debate Citizens United, but I think it is worth mentioning up at the top that that Supreme Court decision came down in 2010. And in a nutshell, what that decision did is it paved the way for more dark money to flood our elections. Essentially, dark money is money that can't be traced back to the original donor. So donor A gives to organization Y. You know that organization Y got involved in this race, but you never know who donor A was, right? That happened in 2010. What else happened in 2010? The census. In 2011, we had a redraw based on that new census data. And in 2012, Republicans won a 60-39 majority in the Ohio House in our General Assembly. And since then, our Ohio House and our General Assembly as a whole has continued to grow more and more lopsided with Republican majority control. I think it's important to note that prior to 2015, there were no guardrails in state law that would constrict or give guidance to the General Assembly on how they were drawing their own districts. Does that seem a little funny to you? Yeah, it's a little funny, it's a little concerning. And citizens, much like yourselves, had been watching that, right? They had been watching the process, seeing this lopsided majority grow and grow, the supermajority. And the only restrictions were federal law, right? Districts needed to be similar in population size, and there couldn't be any sort of racial disparities therein. But again, there were no state law boundaries that were put in place. So citizens got together, said, we need to fix this problem. And they ended up putting a constitutional amendment on the ballot in 2015 that passed with flying colors. It passed with over 70% of the vote. If we can put up, oh, the slide is already up. So essentially, this amendment did a couple of things. It did add some more rules, some procedures, some guidelines. It said not only should the districts be similar in size, but they should actually reflect the partisan balance of the state as a whole. Additionally, they said, instead of the General Assembly just getting to oversee this entirely themselves, let's create the Ohio Redistricting Commission. So this flow chart that you see behind me here kind of lays out who's on that commission and the process that they should follow. It was a 7-person commission that includes the governor, the secretary of state, the auditor, and then 4 legislative seats, 2 for the House, 2 for the Senate, 1 for majority party members, 1 for minority party members. But if you are keeping score, and I'm sure you are, given that we are a Republican stronghold state with a supermajority legislature, that would create a 5-2 partisan breakdown on the commission. Think about that for a second. A 5-2 split means that you're always going to have one party, no matter who it is, you're always going to have one party that is in control, that's going to be able to put their thumb on the scales, right, and rig it for themselves. And that's exactly what we saw playing out. Now, the process that was created did have some safeguards in it. So essentially, the commission would propose a map. Then there would have to be public hearings with public input. If there was a vote that was bipartisan, then the map could go into effect for 10 years. If it wasn't bipartisan, they would have to try again, go through the process again. If it was bipartisan, 10-year map. If not, you get a 4-year map. And then either way, there was an avenue with the Supreme Court of Ohio for litigation. If we could move to the next slide. So the process took over a year. It took 18 months or so. We had the 2020 census. This played out through 2020, 2021 with a redraw. And ultimately, it was not a bipartisan vote. It was going to be a 4-year map. I have to shout out the League of Women Voters of Ohio, APRI, and others that partnered with my organization, the ACLU of Ohio, for one of many lawsuits about this process and the maps. The Supreme Court of Ohio ruled the maps unconstitutional not once, not twice, not thrice, 7 times. That's quite a bit. And unfortunately, we all got to go to the polls in 2022 and vote with unconstitutional maps. I often like to say that running out the clock isn't just an effective strategy in sports like basketball, but sometimes in political processes too. And that's essentially what happened, right? There are just timelines to make elections happen, and the clock ran out, and we went to the polls with unconstitutional maps. I did want to include this slide, though, because I think it's really telling. What you're seeing at the top is the partisan breakdown before the lawsuit and then after the lawsuit. And at first blush, it looks really good, right? You see, okay, it's 35% to 65% up at the top. That's a huge lopsided supermajority. We don't like that. And then after the lawsuit, it's 45% to 55%. That's looking a lot better. What's concerning, though, is underneath. If we can go to the next slide. So gerrymandering, rather than voters choosing their elected officials get to flip the script and pick their voters. And what's interesting with gerrymandering in Ohio is that means that lawmakers and elected officials really only have to worry about their primary election. Like, that's where the real competition plays out. It's in their partisan primary, not November. So our friends at the Brennan Center actually took a look and did the research for this year. What you're seeing is research for 2024. And 15 districts out of our 99 House districts were wholly uncontested. So 15 of them, we just know what the outcome is going to be. 84 districts actually had candidates from both major parties, but 62 of the 84 districts were uncompetitive races, which means that the likely winner is likely going to win with 55% or more of the vote, right? So that's why when you see on the previous slide where it was 45% to 55%, the system was rigged. The way the map was drawn, it looks good on its face, but it was actually a rigged map. In a year that is a red wave, it would be an incredible red wave legislatively here in Ohio. And in a year that is a blue wave, you would barely see a touch of baby blue in the state of Ohio, in our Ohio House and Ohio Senate. And this means that 9.1 million Ohioans, or 77% of us, live in a district this November that is uncontested or uncompetitive. And that is good for no one. So if we can go to the next slide. So what that means, what that looks like for our legislature is this incredible supermajority Republican legislature that you can see above my shoulder. I argue that a supermajority really only benefits those in power, and it really hurts the silent majority. It takes away any need to moderate, to work across the aisle, to really have a true exchange of ideas, to do what's best for everybody in Ohio, not just power players. Additionally, we're supposed to have a system of checks and balances in the United States, right? We have our judiciary, our legislative branch, our executive branch. They're supposed to check each other. One of the checks on the legislature is a governor's veto. And here in Ohio, to overcome a governor's veto, it requires a 3/5 vote in both chambers, both in your House and in your Senate. So in the House, 3/5 is 60 votes. In the Senate, it's 20 votes. Easy peasy, right? They have that plus more. So even if a couple people are absent, if a couple people are sick, it doesn't matter. They're still going to be able to override the governor's veto, and they have done it several times. So let's take a step back and think about that age-old question: is Ohio a red state, a blue state, a purple state? what kind of state are we? I think everybody has had that chat over coffee or maybe wine with your friends. And I think we can answer that question tonight, maybe. But you can't gerrymander a statewide race, right? Gerrymandering happens at the district level, not the state level. So we can look at our Senate races. In the last Senate race, J.D. Vance won with about 53% of the vote. If you look at the last time Sherrod Brown won, he won with 53% of the vote also. If you look at Donald Trump, he carried Ohio with 52% of the vote, and I think 51.5% of the vote. And if you look over the last 10 to 12 years or so, in statewide elections, Ohio tends to cut about 54 to 46. 54 to 46. Does this look like 54 to 46 behind me here? No, it does not. This is a huge 2-to-1, 3-to-1 lopsided supermajority. It does not actually comport with how Ohioans typically are showing up to the polls. And the impact of that is clear. If we can move to the next slide. This unfortunately has allowed us to end up with a legislature that is not responsive to the will of voters and at times is diametrically opposed to what the majority will of the people of Ohio is. There's a power imbalance, and I would argue that as a whole, the legislature is quite a bit out of touch. And all you have to do to start to find the evidence of that is to look at the elections playing out in 2023. In 2022, our General Assembly got rid of special elections, right? They were burdensome, time-consuming, expensive, and not worth the effort. What do you know? They hear rumblings about a reproductive rights measure going on the November ballot, and all of a sudden they're like, you know what we need? We need a special election. So they brought the special elections back. Not only did that, but then passed a House and Senate joint resolution to put an anti-democracy effort on the ballot, and voters saw right through it. That went down. It lost by about 14 points. Ohioans said, we don't want you to make it harder for us to put things on the ballot. The irony there is that they were trying to change the threshold to 60% plus one for a constitutional amendment, but their effort could have passed with a simple majority, 50% plus one. That doesn't seem so fair. We all have seen over the years lawmakers being slow on medical marijuana and adult use cannabis. We've seen them put forth many attacks on reproductive rights. And then what do you know? In November of 2023, voters overwhelmingly supported a reproductive freedom measure as well as adult use cannabis measures, which again just shows how out of touch the General Assembly can be. If we can go to the next slide. All legislation originates in committees, and I think it's important to look kind of in the weeds how these bills, how the out-of-touch bills really originate in the General Assembly and how the supermajority hurts us from top to bottom. This session, we have over 60 committees. That's a lot of committees. We have House Higher Education, Primary, Secondary Education, Judiciary, Ways and Means, Transportation, you name it, all bills live and die in committee. And the majority leadership has a lot of control over the committees, right? The House gets to determine who chairs the committee, what experience they have in that issue area, how they feel about it. A good example, unrelated to what we're talking about tonight, criminal justice. Are you putting someone who is a prosecutor in judiciary or criminal justice as the chair, or someone that was a public defender, right? Like those are the types of choices, decisions the majority leadership gets to make on a committee. Additionally, the committee makeup is going to look the same as the legislature as the whole. So that partisan balance is going to be the same. So you see the lopsided supermajorities in the House and Senate over my shoulder. That carries down to the committee. The smaller the committee, the smaller numbers of the minority party. There are actually some committees that only have one Democrat, right? And at the end of the day, Republicans don't need a single Democrat vote to pass anything out of committee. And again, they have all the votes they need to pass it on the floor. And if it passes both chambers, it gets to the governor, they can overcome that governor's veto. So again, the impact of gerrymandering is really clear and I think very dangerous here in Ohio.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, so that's a basic explanation of how gerrymandering shapes the composition of our General Assembly and how it shapes the dynamic within the General Assembly. And keep that in mind when you say, well, I like my representative. Well, remember, your representative is going to Columbus to work in the system that Jocelyn described. So now let's move to the specific impact of gerrymandering on education policy. We're going to open with the topic of public school funding and specifically vouchers being offered to Ohioans to send their children to private school. And then after that, we will proceed to some other topics in education where the role of gerrymandering seems pretty clear. So I will turn the podium over then to our two educators, AJ and Dan.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I first would like to thank the League of Women Voters for giving us this opportunity to be here this evening. This probably, regardless of what issue is important to Ohio, there's probably no more important issue than issue one, because from it, all other issues stem. And so if we want pragmatic, practical policies that work for all Ohioans, this is a very critical opportunity for the voters of the state to be heard. So to give you some background on the state's belief on education, that started really in the late 80s. In 1989, I went and looked this up before I was able to correct the slide or after. 1989, we instituted what's called open enrollment. And so the basic concept in the state of Ohio under conservative leadership has been the money should follow the child. And open enrollment is an opportunity for the money to follow the child. If you weren't happy with the public school you're enrolled in, you could then choose to enroll through the application process into another school that accepted open enrollment students. So that's been around a long time. It's, I think public schools are now quite used to it. Most schools in the state of Ohio do it. The state of Ohio is even considering mandating it where it's interdistrict open enrollment. You can't choose to only accept those that are of contiguous boundaries of your district. It might be complete interdistrict. So look for that in the coming legislative sessions. But currently, you get to choose whether or not you're interdistrict for any district or just your neighboring districts. But in the late 90s, under Governor Voinovich, we saw this push to start giving, and I'm going to use the words that have been thrown around, students opportunities to escape what are labeled as failing schools. That's a very contentious phrase, one that is very debatable, not one that I'm going to say that I believe in or adhere to. So in the late 90s, you got the Cleveland program, 96, 97, and that was a chance for students and their families to take state money and use it towards tuition at a private school. And then you also had the autism scholarship come around in the 2004, 2005 school year, and you also had the John Peterson scholarship. Naturally, these are scholarships for families with special ed students. Autism and educating an autism student can be very expensive. It's a very lucrative scholarship to help fund that expensive education at a parent's choice. And then the John Peterson scholarship is also a special education scholarship, a lot of times weighted towards the child's disability, but it's another opportunity for a parent to take that money and find a provider that better can meet the needs of their students. But where we really get into problems is when the state decided to say, well, you know what, that Cleveland program, which the Supreme Court has ruled legal, really would look good if we can expand it. So in the 06-07 school year, they had Ed Choice scholarships, and it did an expansion effort where the Cleveland concept could be applied to schools across the state. But the catch was, if you were a failing school, didn't matter what your income level was in the community, where you were, if you were urban, suburban, or rural, if you were labeled a failing school based on the report card and the No Child Left Behind metrics, then you could take that scholarship and leave your public school, take the money to fund your tuition at a private school. And most of us became comfortable with that because a lot of public schools were not failing. So as superintendent or a principal at that time, our school was successful. There was never really a threat. But in 13-14, under some leadership in the House, and a certain Senate president was a House member at that time, and I remember seeing video where he said, well, we're just looking to expand the opportunity where the lowest income people can now take a scholarship opportunity and go to the private school of their choice. And we're not really looking to expand this upwards. We want to help those who are most in need. So they instituted what we now know as the first wave of ed choice expansion. And what I would say here is there's an old adage or a catchphrase where people say, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. And our state legislature embodies that, because what they started was a movement afoot to gradually work their way into universal vouchers, which is where we are for the most part right now. So in 2013 or 14, you start to see a gradual expansion. The first time it was like, oh, this is just for grades K to 2, and those within 200% of the federal poverty level. And gradually it went K to 4, K to 8, and then K to 12. And then at the same time, the federal poverty level increased. We're in the last budget cycle. Prior to the current budget, they got it up to 400% of the federal poverty level. And right now, that's still the threshold for a full voucher. So a family of 4 making $135,000 a year are eligible for a $6,100 and some change for an elementary voucher in K to 8. And for a high school voucher in grades 9 to 12, they're eligible for $8,408. And then in this current budget, they expanded that and started means testing the vouchers so that as you get above the 400% poverty level, they gradually start to ratchet down that scholarship amount to the point where I think it maxes out at 750% of the poverty level. So I don't tend to look at the top of that chart. I just know that if you're over 135,000, you get a family of 4, you're at 700,000, or excuse me, 700% of the federal poverty level, you're probably doing pretty well. And now the state government of Ohio is subsidizing your child's private education. So next slide. Where does this money go? So first of all, let me say that the vouchers take many forms across the country. In Ohio, we tend to pay schools directly. So the money indirectly is following the child, but I believe it's monthly is the logistics where the money is paid to private schools. Many other states have what's called educational savings accounts, and that's a very common feature as well. And then there's tuition tax credits, and many of those have been tested in courts. Most recently, I believe we saw last week, the South Carolina Supreme Court ruled their educational savings accounts are unconstitutional in that state. So Ohio is not the only state where we are using litigation to try to get the court to rule vouchers unconstitutional. But the slide behind me shows you that most of the money is going to private schools. 3 prominent states. This source is from the National Coalition of Public Education. These are states that were out in the voucher game before us and are a little step or two ahead of us. And you can see that in Arizona, you've got about 80% of the money going to private schools. Meanwhile, the state is also seeing a budget crunch because of the expansion of vouchers. You see New Hampshire's 89% of the voucher money goes to private or people that are already in private school. And in Wisconsin, it's 75% of the money. And that trend is no different in Ohio. Next slide, please. So incidentally, some of these numbers up here might be a little bit dated. I got them off of the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. They have a report portal website. But latest number we got was $966 million as of June, early June. But here's the interesting kicker. Families had until June 30th of 2024 to apply for a voucher from last year. And in many cases, those families applying had already finished the school year and still had an opportunity to apply for that $6,000 or for that $8,000. Okay, so we don't really know those final figures yet because they haven't been released, but we're confident that it's well above 91,000 vouchers under Ed Choice expansion, and that number is actually pushing $1 billion or more when those final numbers get released. But what I've tried to compile for you behind me is some suburbanite schools in the greater Cleveland area. I threw one from Portage County in there, wealthy community, Aurora. We also have Nordonia down in Summit County as well. And then I threw some Cuyahoga County schools in here so you can see the difference. And when you look at the chart, what I tried to show you in the first 2 columns were attendance and enrollment in those public schools. And what the first column shows you, if I'm not mistaken, is the 22-23 school year. And then the second column shows you the 23-24 school year. And the one conclusion you can make by looking at one change in enrollment is enrollment in public schools has remained stable. And then the next two columns show you the increase in the vouchers used in the community, not the school. So when you look at those voucher counts, you will see in Aurora and some of those districts at the top, 2,000% increase. When you see schools in Cuyahoga County, 1,000% increase, 1,900% increase, or 400% increase. And then at the bottom, you can see the total for Cuyahoga County and the total for the state of Ohio. So one logical conclusion is that as public school enrollment remains the same or relatively stable, we are not seeing a mass exodus because of vouchers out of public schools and into private. Quite frankly, privates don't have the room to handle that mass exodus, but that mass exodus doesn't exist. So next slide. That's Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights.
Excellent. Yeah, I thought, first of all, wanted to say thank you to our friends in the Shaker Board of Ed and the City of Shaker who are here tonight. Thank you for hosting us this evening. I wanted to make this personal and give us some data for our communities. And so what we see is that in Cleveland Heights, University Heights, the state of Ohio gives us foundation funding, which is your basic state funding, about $11 million and change. And that breaks down to $2,307 per student. In Shaker receives about $12 million in change, breaking it down to $2,773 per student. So the state of Ohio funds a high school student in Shaker $2,700 to attend the Shaker schools, but the state of Ohio, under Ed Choice as it stands today, will give the same student $8,400 to attend a private school. This is the battle. This is the inherent injustice in the Ed Choice system. I don't know if I'm happy or sad to tell you that it is also a violation of Ohio's Constitution. And so we have made the difficult decision to move into litigation against the state of Ohio. So we didn't want this. I want to sort of begin there. The last thing in the world that we wanted to do was to sue the state of Ohio, but nothing else worked. We tried lobbying ourselves. We hired lobbyists. We drove to Columbus more times than I want to count to give testimony. But in the system in Ohio, it's so gerrymandered that there is absolutely nothing, no response. Their decision is made before you show up. They very often feel like they're doing you a favor by giving you your 3 minutes. And then they ignore what you've said. So we didn't want to sue the state of Ohio, but as board members, I'm sure every board member in the state of Ohio knows the term their fiduciary responsibility. We have a unique responsibility to our taxpayers to protect the integrity of their tax dollars. This is something that we take very, very seriously because our communities trust us with their money. And so we struggled. In Cleveland Heights, University Heights, AJ mentioned, that the initial expansion of Ed Choice didn't impact many districts in the state of Ohio, but the districts that it did impact were districts like Cleveland Heights, University Heights, majority minority and majority poverty districts. The students in our desks are both majority minority and majority poverty. Ohio has 611 public school districts. Of those 600, give or take, public school districts, roughly 30 are majority minority and majority poverty. Sociologists call that intersectionalism. I call that a target. And the reason that I call that a target is that those 30 districts represented 90% of the Ed Choice vouchers that came from the Ed Choice system, 90%. So I insist that majority, minority, majority poverty districts were targeted. My district was losing around $16 million a year. I talk about the Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit as it's related to school funding. The Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit is a taxpayer revolt because we are now spending $1 billion. Bill Phillips calls it the $1 billion boondoggle. We're spending $1 billion of taxpayer funds on something that people don't want. The citizens of Ohio are not interested in funding public schools to the tune of $1 billion when there's nothing in the state constitution that directs them to do it. Not even the other side says that this is their responsibility to do. They're struggling hard enough to find a defense for the claims in the lawsuit. No, none of them say that this is something that they have to do. But these fiscal conservatives, as they call themselves when they're running for election, continue to do it. So they have no responsibility to do it, but they do it anyway.
And if I could interject, there's something to think about with the Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit. It stems from an unwillingness for a state legislature to authentically engage in compromise and listen.
Hear, hear.
There is an attitude that prevails down there that when you go to lobby, you, as Dan said, you get your 3 minutes, you get placated and pat you on the back and walk out the door. You never really feel like you've got an authentic opportunity to shape that legislation. There have been some opportunities, and I will give the state legislature credit. They'd made a significant investment in public education. However, they are going to fall short of that mandate in DeRolf because by not funding us fully, what they fail to realize is that they're going to hurt the ability of public schools to stay off the ballot. When you're pushing $1 billion to private ed, you're asking local taxpayers to fund 3 systems of schools: the public charters, our regular public schools, and private schools. So there's no relief to property taxpayers or property owners in a community because you're getting to that situation where they are intent on funding private education. And by shortchanging schools at 50% last year is what the level of the Fair School Funding Plan was financed at. And this year it's funded at a 67% level. We're phasing it in 1/8 at a time, I believe is what it is. But we're full bore with private education. Now, let me ask you this question. When the budget gets tight, and it will get tight, are they going to cap vouchers? Because I'll tell you what they're going to do to school funding. They're going to freeze it. Just like when we had the crisis in 08, 09, and Kasich was in office, local government funds got cut and school budgets got frozen. So my guess from history is that when push comes to shove in tight budget times and we're not sitting on, a big rainy day fund of $3 billion and a budget surplus of $5 to $6 billion currently in the coffers, we're going to have to pay the piper, and public schools very well could be on the end of that. And that's where you're going to see us failing to meet that mandate that the court said is we need to quit relying or having an over-reliance on property taxes. So very important in that regard. So it is, in some regards, as Dan said, it's an effort to not only stand up for public school students, but taxpayers as a whole across the state, because we're all footing the bill.
So after meeting for about a year and a half, each month, I should back up, right at the very beginning of COVID, about 6 or 7 folks from around the state of Ohio started having a conference call. And it was actually a conference call because nobody had heard of Zoom yet. But we quickly did because we were in the midst of the COVID shutdown. And so each month, our numbers on those calls and eventually Zooms grew, and we had more and more districts from around the state represented in those calls. And we found some seed money. And we used that seed money to hire a law firm to do a study as to whether or not the Ed Choice program aligns with the Ohio Constitution. Months later, the law firm reported back that it does not. And the firm identified 5 different ways that the Ed Choice program violates Ohio's state constitution. Now, this matters to an elected official because every elected official in the state of Ohio swears an oath. We swear to uphold and defend both the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Ohio. And so now, being informed that the Ed Choice system violates the state of Ohio, I have an obligation to live up to my oath. So we decided to, as a group, partner with Bill Phillips's Ohio Coalition for Equity and Advocacy. That is the organization that successfully won the famous DeRolf case 27 years ago. And we use that as a council of governance. And I am honored to say that Cleveland Heights University Heights was the first plaintiff in the Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit because of our status sort of as the poster child of the damage done by the Ed Choice system. So on January 4th, 2022, the lawsuit was filed in Franklin County and was assigned ultimately to Judge Jasa Page. The state immediately filed arguments to dismiss all 5 of our charges. This was expected, of course. After about 6 months of carefully considering those motions, Judge Page rejected all 5 of their motions. So all 5 of our claims have made it through the first legal hurdle. Ohio Senate, it's worth pointing out that in the time since, we've been doing the stuff of a lawsuit. We've been putting out depositions for testimony. We've been assembling evidence, sharing evidence with the other side. Dozens and dozens of subpoenas have gone out. Only one subpoena has either side received pushback on. And that is from the president of the Ohio Senate, who insisted that he has nothing to do with this. It's his plan. Sadly, he won. So he will not be testifying in the lawsuit. It does beg the question, though, if you've got nothing to hide, why hide? Nonetheless, we've been eager to get into court. We have been submitting all of our filings early. We have been pushing for a trial as early as we can possibly get into a courthouse. And the state has slow rolled at every turn, asking for extensions, filing motions that are virtually laughable. The simple explanation is that both sides of this lawsuit know that the law is on our side. So I'm happy to report that we have a trial date. It will be the most important thing that happens in the first week of November, right? Yes, we are going into court finally the first week of November. We're eager to have the case heard by Judge Page. We expect the trial to last about a week. Regardless of the outcome, though, again, this is a process. Whatever happens in Franklin County, the losing side will appeal. We'll go to the appellate court before it ultimately ends up in Ohio's Supreme Court, which is a race that we are closely keeping an eye on. Before I move forward, though, I really want to just talk a little bit about the idea of school choice. And I want to just point out that this is nonsense. The notion of school choice, it does not exist. It is merely a destructive fallacy that has been normalized through repetition. And to explain this, I ask everyone to consider where else in the civic galaxy does such a thing exist, where people can decide where to spend what they've decided is their tax money. Imagine that I no longer wanted to use public transportation because it was inconvenient for me, or it didn't fit my family's needs, would I be able to get a ride voucher so that I could use Uber? Are Ohio taxpayers expected to pay for my Uber rides? What about parks? What about local parks? If local parks are no longer what I've decided I want my family, or heaven knows, pools, can I get a rec voucher to use for a country club, to use to go to Six Flags or Cedar Point? Of course, these are absurd. But these are absolutely the same thing as this notion of school choice. There is no such thing as school choice. So we have 5 claims. All 5 claims have been, as I mentioned, they have been vetted. They have gone through. We are very, very confident, and we are extremely eager to get inside the courthouse first week of November in Franklin County.
We have a little more time.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, actually, as I've been listening. I know question time comes later for everybody else, but I have moderator's privilege here. So is there, as I understand voucher funding, what happens is the program is authorized in the budget. There's a line item for the education budget, and vouchers are a part of that. But that goes into your argument that more money for vouchers cuts into money for public because, you know, it's a single line item. Have there ever been individual votes in the Ohio General Assembly on vouchers?
Thank you for that. No. It has been always pushed into the Ohio budget. And the Ohio budget is important. It's important to understand that the Ohio budget is not accessible through a state initiative. You cannot go after something in the budget through state initiative. It's also worth pointing out that when we're talking about the impact on public education of vouchers, we're looking at $1 billion a year. In dirty math, if a teacher in Ohio costs, all told, $100,000 a year, you're looking at the ability, instead of spending $1 billion on vouchers, to surge 10,000 teachers into Ohio's public classrooms.
Do you have, okay, that's something for everyone to digest here. But in going on to our gerrymandering topic, do you have any indication? So we've never had an actual vote by the legislators, have to stand up and say, yes, I support public money for private schools. Is there any indication from other states? Are there any situations where this kind of program has been put to a public vote? Any indication of popular support for or against vouchers?
Thanks for that question. I cannot, I know there has been a vote recently in the state of Kentucky through the source of the National Coalition of Public Education. One of their resources in their public schools toolkit shows that about from 1970 to 2022, there have been about 12 different instances where voucher issues have been on the ballot in some form or another. And generally, as Dan alluded to earlier, most of the time, the general public does not support it. And when vote totals have been tallied, and unfortunately I'm not equipped with those details in front of me, and I can get that resource for anybody, you'll see anywhere from 60 to 70% of the vote is against the voucher proposal. I can tell you that, again, there's been about 10 to 12 instances since 1970 where vouchers have been put before the public, and the public generally does not support that issue.
And about 90% of Ohio's school children attend our public schools, with only 10% using private schools.
Yeah, that's helpful. And then also geographic just for the audience's information, geographic dispersion of private schools. We live in the Cleveland area, most of us. There are private schools everywhere. What about the rest of the state?
Well, that's a hot topic because, one of the problems we have, and this is the crux of the gerrymandering issue with the state of Ohio and public ed, is that you've got Senate leadership that basically is on record saying we can kind of do whatever we want. Now, is that not toxic for democracy? Because a healthy republic is based on a representation of minority rights and minority interests. It doesn't mean, obviously, the minority gets their way, but it means you have a seat at the table and it's authentic. But when you espouse the notion of we can do whatever we want, it kind of implies, thank you, next, move on. And so what the Senate leadership has said following the last biennial budget is now that there's universal vouchers, is the next fight is access. And that access takes the form of school construction. And so in the middle of every budget cycle, there's a mid-biennial budget capital bill that passes. Jocelyn could give you a lot more nuanced details, but basically what construction projects across the state are we going to fund? And I believe there were about $4 million appropriated to private school construction efforts this past summer. In fact, just within the last 2 weeks, ProPublica came out with an expose about Ohioans are now funding construction for private schools. And the Senate leadership has basically said that's our next challenge because you don't have choice if you don't have access, were his direct words. Mm-hmm. And so we will see that in some form or fashion in the next biennial budget fight where the state is going to push to one, this is me with conjecture, we're going to get rid of the caps on income. That to me is what I think is the next step. And then we're also going to try to find a way to increase appropriations for construction. That's just been the state's mode for the last 3 budget cycles, gradually increasing that access to voucher dollars.
Thanks for that. I think that is an answer to what I was asking, which is, I guess, where are there private schools? There are some around here, but more than half the counties do not have any private schools. Rural counties tend not to have private schools. What you're saying is the next step is see if we can't promote construction of some private schools.
And if I may add, if anybody pays attention to this issue, Texas within the last 9 months went through a battle in that state where rural conservative legislatures stood up for public education and defeated voucher efforts from that leadership in the governor's office to expand it and create universal vouchers. And then, as is common in the state of Ohio, when you don't get what you want, leadership turns around and primaries you in your own party so they can get people in there that are more conducive to the grift.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Now for the audience, a reminder, we will be taking all of your questions soon. I welcome any further questions about the voucher program for clarification, perhaps. But first, I think we should touch on some other topics of education where the role of gerrymandering seems to be pretty clearly strong in terms of selection of priorities by the members of our General Assembly. So Jocelyn has a few if you go to the Honesty for Ohio Education website, you'll discover a dizzying number of these, and Jocelyn has chosen a few.
I have chosen just a few. I would also like to take a privilege and answer a question that wasn't asked before I dive into these bills. You might be sitting here thinking, why? Why is this happening with vouchers? Who's benefiting? What is happening behind the scenes? I always like to ask the question of the 5 W's, if you will. What is happening here? And usually the cynic in me goes, well, it probably comes down to money somewhere. Someone is benefiting. There are private industries that benefit. We all know that there are websites like followthemoney.org, Open Secrets, things like that. But something I just want to shout out that we have here in Ohio, that if you have a couple free hours on your, weekend, if you want to check it out, it's the joint, it's JLEC, the Joint Legislative Ethics Committee. JLEC is the entity where all government relations officials and lobbyists have to register on behalf of the organizations that they are lobbying for. If you put my name in there, you are going to see that I'm a registered lobbyist for the ACLU of Ohio. I don't hide that. Everybody on the policy team is a registered lobbyist. It will also just show all of the bills the ACLU is working on. It's not going to show that I'm buying steak dinners for anyone. I'm also vegan, so I wouldn't do that. But you can see everyone who's lobbying and what interests they are lobbying for. And knowledge is power. So I encourage you to do some digging if these issues are important to you. I would love to know what you've uncovered. So let us know. We are in the second year of our 2-year full term legislature. So our 2 years will be up December 31st. So I don't have the data for this General Assembly because we're still in it. And that period between Election Day and the end of December is usually a real hot one where a lot of bills move. But if you take a look at the last legislative session, there were over 200 bills that touched education that were introduced. Over 200 bills. Now that sounds like a lot, just hearing the number 200. But if I tell you that in a given legislative session, that 2-year period, typically you see between 1,000 and 1,200 bills, you really start to raise your eyebrows like, wow, 20% of what the lawmakers are doing touches education in some way, right? That is concerning given what we know about the types of bills that are being pushed. If they were better bills, maybe we would be less concerned. But while the bills may differ in their number, in their title, and in the specific substance of the bill, I think the collective impact of many of the bills put forth last session and this session are the same. These are bills that micromanage things at the local level. They micromanage schools, administrators, parents, teachers, and students. They sow distrust, dissension. They cause a chilling effect of honest discussions and education within the classroom. They other marginalized identities, and they silence the many diverse opinions, perspectives, identities, and experiences that we're really lucky to have here in Ohio. And I think the bigger concern for me is that these types of bills, they really steer us away from the real issues that we have with education. We know that there is a growing teacher shortage. I am the proud daughter of a former public school teacher. My dad was on the Board of Education. I myself adjunct teach. It's really concerning that we have a growing teacher shortage here in Ohio. It distracts from conversations on school funding, and we all know that schools are under-resourced. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows a teacher or knows someone who has gone to the store to buy things for the classroom that they shouldn't have to purchase, right? We know that these are real problems, and unfortunately, the legislature is distracting away from those very real issues at the local level. Now, while there are dozens and dozens of bills related to education this session, I just wanted to touch on 2 that I have dubbed culture wars bills, and it just goes to show kind of the distracted nature of the legislature and the things that they are pushing and pursuing that I would argue are out of touch with the will and the desire of the majority of Ohioans. And the first bill that I would like to discuss is Senate Bill 83, which is on the slide above my shoulder. This is a sweeping, I would call it anti-higher education bill. Our friends at Honesty for Ohio Education have dubbed it the Higher Education Destruction Act. This bill is sponsored by Senator Jerry Serino, who is up here in Northeast Ohio, adjacent in District 18 by Kirtland. And this bill is really concerning enough that I put a red alarm next to a couple of the bullet points about the bill. This bill is long. It is not unique. I call it a Frankenstein bill. We all know that there is this entity called ALEC that churns out different pieces of legislation that pop up in state to states. I think what you see in Senate Bill 83 is kind of things that have popped up around the country, all kind of mushed together into one, again, it's almost Halloween season, into like a Frankenstein bill. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of those provisions. One of the most concerning is that it directly impacts academic freedoms when it comes to so dubbed controversial beliefs and issues in the classroom. And I'm going to read actual text from the bill. Senate Bill 83 mandates that schools allow and encourage students to reach their own conclusions about all controversial beliefs or policies and shall not seek to indoctrinate any social, political, or religious point of view. You know, you could read that and go, yeah, we don't want indoctrination, right? Indoctrination sounds bad. The part that I get a little tripped up on and is concerning is allow and encourage students to reach their own conclusions about all controversial beliefs. And then the bill goes on to define controversial beliefs. However, it's an including list, not a comprehensive definition. There's a lot of gray here. So much gray. It is muddy. It is murky. You don't know. But the definition the bill provides is any belief or policy, the subject of political controversy, including issues such as climate policy, electoral politics, foreign policy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, immigration, marriage, or abortion. Interesting, right? If you Google Senate Bill 83, one of the biggest questions that out there is, what if there's a Holocaust denier in the classroom? What happens then? I think the fact that that question is being asked just shows how dangerous this bill is, right? The fact that the question even has to be asked. At best, I would argue, if passed, Senate Bill 83 would inhibit the ability to really have honest conversations about history, the history internationally, in our own country, and in our own backyard here in Ohio. It would have a severe, severe chilling effect. Additionally, it restricts mandatory DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging type programs. We know that those programs can remedy past harms, prevent future ones, yet SB 83 would make that illegal. Additionally, SB 83 is the biggest attack on workers' rights since SB 5. If we take a trip down memory lane, SB 5 was 2011. It would have curtailed collective bargaining rights for public employees. SB 83 laughs in the face of citizens defeated that measure, SB 5, right, in 2011. SB 83 laughs in the face of that, even though the people, made their voices heard, and it would remove the right from university employees to strike, right? So it would weaken workers' rights, and that's why over 100 workers' rights organizations and unions have come out against Senate Bill 83. There are unfunded mandates all over this bill. There are all kinds of other provisions that I don't have time to get into, but things like posting your curricula, your syllabus, but also I believe the gender of the teacher and who the teachers are for different classes. It's a really prescriptive bill. It's really long. It has a lot of concerning stuff. And the reason I picked it, and I put the red alarm here, is because it passed the Ohio Senate and the Ohio House Committee, which means it just needs a Ohio House floor vote. Going back several slides, and we know the supermajority that the Republicans have, it would be really easy for them to pass this bill. So if you are concerned about this bill and other bills like it, you can go to ACLUohio.org/act and take action. Go to our friends at Honesty for Ohio Education and learn more about it. Additionally, I know I don't have too much time left, but I would be remiss not to mention one other bill because it shows a common, very concerning tactic about how to pass kind of sneaky legislation in Ohio. So if we can go to the next slide. So House Bill 183 was the anti-trans bathroom bill, and this bill was slowly moving through the Ohio House. And then what do you know? It was added into Senate Bill 104 that was already further along in the political process. Senate Bill 104 is called the College Credit Plus bill that I'm not an expert on this bill, but it tinkers with the program. It makes some, administrative changes to the program, and they put House Bill 183 into that. Okay, since Senate Bill 104 had already passed through the Senate, now that House Bill 183 was added to it, it just needs to go back to the Senate for an up-down concurrence vote. The Senate can't amend it, can't change anything, can't strip 183 back out of it. The Senate just gets to decide, Do we want to pass 104, which was college credit plus, with the addition of House Bill 183, or do we not? Right? And who knows what that decision is going to be, but I would be pretty concerned. This bill is a micromanaging type bill, I would argue. It takes the control out of the hands of folks at the local level, and it mandates who can use what bathroom, when, where, and why. And it would create really unsafe environments for transgender people all across Ohio. And everybody should be able to access something like a restroom without fear of persecution or harassment. So again, we could wax poetic about multiple bills, but I thought these are just two bills that are very, very close to crossing the finish line and eventually becoming law here in Ohio. So please keep an eye out after the election, before the end of the year.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, follow up, what you've just described seems like kind of a cousin of the voucher funding mechanism we just talked about, which is a way of putting stuff in legislation in order to avoid a full and separate vote on that topic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, now, can we link that kind of mechanism to gerrymandering, or would we call that just the way people work in a legislature?
Well, I think that if there was, if we had multiple parties of relatively equal power, these things would not happen because they would have to make compromises. As it is now, they have absolutely no need to compromise, to consider other ideas. They're just forcing through everything that they want to get done.
Yeah.
And that leads to the next question is, where do they get their ideas for what they want to get done? Because we're talking about some things that I think the underlying assumption is, if you ask any citizen, citizens of Ohio, list your favorite topics that you think the legislature needs to deal with. Would it be trans people in bathrooms? It might be, because they've been told it's an issue. But I mean, sort of going back to that, where do these ideas start?
If I can add or take that one first, I think, Jocelyn said earlier, a key word that I think has been integral to the voucher explosion, and that's the word distrust. And I think COVID and subsequent years gave our legislature the perfect opportunity to exacerbate the growth in vouchers by adopting some culture war legislative concepts to sow distrust in the public for their public schools. And we all know what's in the news, and we all know what gets covered. And so we've had to fight those battles across the state of Ohio, from litter boxes to trans rights, you name it. Districts are confronted with that in their communities. And I think those have really created an opportunity for the legislature and legislators to get clicks and likes, fundraising, and at the same time move legislation that helps sow that distrust to make it easier to sell to the public private dollars or public dollars to private schools. So I think that has been a big key.
Let's back up. I have another data point to add in here. We've been talking about public education and then vouchers for private schools. Private schools come in a variety of forms. They're the so-called independent schools that are not religious. And then there are religious schools, and there may well be other, and then there are, particular educational model like Montessori schools. So, but what percentage of the private schools receiving vouchers are religiously affiliated?
I do not know the answer to that question, but it's very, very high.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to go back to your other question, where do these ideas come from, or why are vouchers getting pushed? Why did the bathroom bill end up in the college credit plus bill? What is happening with SB 83? I think that the honest answer, unfortunately, is that money talks, and there are a lot of powerful entities and organizations that are pushing these types of things because someone benefits. There's always going to be someone that benefits. Also, it's a major presidential election year, and all eyes are on Ohio, as they often are. We like to say that, but it is true. And if a bill gets through here, it typically tends to float around the rest of the country. We've seen it time and time again. You look at states like Florida and Ohio, we tend to be the ones that are pushing some of these bills, North Carolina, Tennessee, and then unfortunately you see the wave. So many times these bills, the original idea maybe wasn't from our state house or our lawmaker. Maybe it was ALEC, maybe it was something else. But unfortunately they end up here.
And I'll be a little more direct. Really, when you're letting special interests write the legislation, that's your problem. She's going to be politically correct in the way she approaches it because of her role. But when you roll out universal vouchers and at the press conference, it's the Center for Christian Values helping write the legislation, and they're at the press conference to say, hey, we got this great idea about universal vouchers. Here's what it is. That's not congruent with the way democracy is supposed to work, with what a majority of the people in the state of Ohio prefer when 90% of the kids are going to public schools.
So I have some questions here about private school accreditation, credentials, and standards. How do the requirements governing private schools and religious, independent and religious schools compare to the standards governing public schools?
Boy, that's an important question. The simple fact of the matter is they don't. We're sending $1 billion of Ohio taxpayers' funds into entities that are by nature, wait for it, private. So they do not have to respond. There's no such thing as a Freedom of Information Act request to a private school. They, public schools are audited extensively. Like an auditor moves into the board office for a couple of weeks every year, as they should. And none of this is a concern of private schools. The truth of the matter is that we don't know for certain if a penny of that money is being spent for education. Is a penny of that money being spent for education? Yes, it absolutely is. But we have no idea how much. It is outside, and the gerrymandered legislature, just with a swipe of their pen, can do this, and they themselves are unaccountable. So it's unaccountable legislators who are shielding all of these private schools from the accountability measures that public schools live under.
So a question comes up, and I think it's worth exploring the mechanism here again that we're talking about. Question was, do all Republicans support the current use of vouchers? And I think we're explaining that we don't know, right? But if no, it seems gerrymandering doesn't matter. So if we're, how then does the gerrymandering specifically affect the support for the voucher program?
All politicians are concerned about self-preservation. And once they get into office, if they're a lowly junior House member or Senate member, the politics of power and self-preservation are going to really fall victim to what the leadership of the party wants. So do all Republicans support vouchers? I think the answer to that is no. I think there's a lot of Republican legislators who represent rural parts of Ohio, just like in Texas, that really advocate for their public schools to the best of their ability within the power structure of the party. However, one of the key Republican senators who last biennial budget cycle here in the hearing process in House committee, John Cross, stood up and advocated. I think his Kettering schools was in his district. And he was very forceful against, I think it was a representative from the Americans for Prosperity who was testifying for vouchers in the House committee. Cross stood up to them, was very forceful, was very adamant about his support for public schools and why vouchers maybe shouldn't be supported. Later that spring, John Cross got primaried. A veteran legislator in the Ohio House is now lame duck. He lost his primary, and he will not be back in the House come January. So there's a prime example where that if you are the contrarian voice within the Republican Party, you might do so at your own peril. And John Cross would be an example of that.
Okay, thank you. That's a good example, an interesting example. Their question has been raised about the structural changes to the boards of education, the State Board of Education, the creation of this new Department of work or education and whatever it is.
Yes.
How do these changes affect the Ed Choice program? And is this development related to gerrymandering at all?
There's a lot to that question. The State Board of Education was also gerrymandered. As a result, and the State Board of Education is also only partially elected. I want to say, and I could be wrong, maybe 11 members are elected and 9 are appointed by the governor. And so the governor has a great deal of power on the State Board of Education to begin with. And now they gerrymandered those districts on top of that. And they have weakened the role of those members of the Ohio State Board of Education. So much so that they really only take, at this point, their only powers are related to teacher licensure and discipline. The legislature, our gerrymandered legislature, reduced the funding for the Department of Education and Workforce so much that the Department of Education and Workforce now has to raise teacher licensing fees in order to have a balanced budget. So that's gerrymandering in the Ohio State Board of Education.
Okay, I think, so we're hearing a theme. I think that gerrymandering produces a situation where, in the words of one of the legislators, we pretty much do whatever we want. And that I think a theme that we're hearing is that if the balance of power were a little more even, there would be more policy discussion and debate, ideally.
I think to add to that answer, and I know this might be an oversimplification, but everything that happens down there is because of gerrymandering. Because one, there's so many of these safe districts that the legislators can do whatever they want. And then there's no accountability within the legislative maneuvering because of the supermajorities that they've created. So it's hard for the minority, whether it's a D or an R, and very rarely is it an R in the minority, but there's no legislative maneuvering to hold the majority accountable. And most importantly, when you're in a safe district, you don't have to go back and answer to your people because they're not holding you accountable because you're winning with 65% of the vote. So there's no accountability back in those home districts. And when you're that safe, it really creates that culture, that aura of we can do whatever we want. So it all really boils down to that safety that they have drawn for themselves on any issue, whether it's education, taxes, you name it.
Additionally, I just want to add on to that a reminder. The legislature doesn't have to play nice with the governor's office either, right? And at times that plays out very publicly that they're not playing nice or getting along. Because the supermajority is so strong because of gerrymandering, like I said, they can overcome a governor's veto, and they do. Another culture wars bill is a great example. House Bill 68, the gender affirming care ban for minors. Governor DeWine actually vetoed that and said he had his own plans and ideas to pursue an administrative route rather than legislative, and the General Assembly just overturned, right? They can do that anytime they want. They need 60 votes in the House. They have 67. They need 20 in the Senate. They have 26. They can do it on any issue that they want.
That leads into another question from the audience. We are talking about education in this particular forum, but Jocelyn, a question for you on policies that are gerrymandered driven. Liz, could you identify, and you just have, a number of non-education issues also impacted by the supermajority environment? And I think we'll limit it to issues in your field of expertise, civil rights, civil liberties.
I mean, there are so many. I think the unfortunate attacks on our LGBTQIA friends and neighbors are the most clear and kind of front of heart and mind for me, because we saw that with HB 68, the gender affirming care ban. We see that now with the bathroom bill. There are other bills. There's one called the Don't Say Gay bill. That's what folks are calling it now, HB 8. I didn't list some of those earlier when I was speaking because they're not quite as far. And I think they're the deep orange alert, but not quite the red that the two bills I picked out were. Additionally, just look at democracy and voting rights, right? We can go back to the example of the August special election and the Senate and House resolutions to make it harder for citizens to qualify for the ballot and then to win if they got to the ballot. The voter ID law, we now in Ohio have one of the most strict voter ID laws in the country. I, for a long time, even though I had an ID to vote, I had my Ohio license, I would bring a utility bill just because I could vote with that here in Ohio. And I just wanted to, right? And sometimes it became an educational experience at my local polling place. Now I can't do that. I have to bring my state driver's license because they have made it very, very strict here in Ohio. So I think there are a number of different issues. Criminal legal system reform, criminal justice actually used to be a sweet spot here in Ohio where you actually could see a lot of bipartisan work across the aisle. Even that is getting very, very difficult nowadays with the supermajority. And a lot of lawmakers that were willing to work across the aisle unfortunately lost their primaries this year. And so I think in the next legislative session, unfortunately, I don't want to predict this, and I really hope I'm wrong, but I do think we may see even more culture wars type bills.
Okay. A point of clarification has been asked, going back to education for a minute. Charter schools, could you explain charter schools, public charter schools? What are they in the universe you've described? We've got public, we've got private. Where do charter schools fit in?
Charter schools are considered public schools in the state of Ohio. Oftentimes are chartered by the state through a sponsoring agency. Might even be that sponsoring agency might even be like an ESC. But on the slide we had up there next to charter schools, think ECOT. Bill Lager was the owner of ECOT. And that was probably the most profound example of charter schools that can resonate with people in the state because of the audit that occurred, where we found out that they were miscounting students on purpose and frauded the state about $60 million. What a lot of people fail to recognize is that is a one-year audit. That was not an audit for their entire existence. So in 1 year, they defrauded Ohio taxpayers $60 million. So, which brings me back to the issue of charters and privates, lack of accountability. Now, we didn't get to that slide, but accountability, I know Dan touched that topic a little bit. That is one of the consequences that has an impact on education in the state of Ohio, is the lack of accountability for charters and privates.
Okay, so charters on the accountability, when you're dividing the universe public, private, you would put charters for accountability. You would put them on sort of the private side, less accountable.
In the area of accountability, scant accountability for charters and privates.
Yeah, they would be accountable to their chartering organization, their hosts.
Okay. Now we've got a few questions about what do we do about gerrymandering, and obviously that's going to be a segue into our discussion of issue 1. But first, before I get to issue 1, is there anything else you would suggest before I start talking about issue 1 that we can do to protect public school funding?
I would say, this conversation has led people from all over the state of Ohio to just pick up the phone and call the members of their Board of Education and find out, are we involved? Are we plaintiffs in the Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit? And if the answer to that is no, to demand that the Board of Education joins the lawsuit as a plaintiff. This is a taxpayer revolt. This is an honesty revolt. This is a way of overcoming the damaging effects of gerrymandering in Ohio. So if you want to engage on this topic, you need to call your local Board of Education and demand that they join the Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit.
Okay. I thought you were going to say call your member of the General Assembly, but I
I've
think
given up on them a long
thank
time
you.
ago.
Okay.
Except we're very fortunate in this district to have a wonderful representative.
Yes. Next, when you go to the polls this November, you will find issue 1 on the ballot. And this is, of course, where we're going with this. This is the Citizens, Not Politicians Amendment to change the way we draw legislative districts in Ohio. So very briefly, it would create a 15-member Citizens Redistricting Commission, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents, selected through a careful screening process. It would ban current or former politicians, political party officials, lobbyists, or large political donors for sitting on the commission for 6 years. Just sort of looking back 6 years of their history. And then after they serve on, anyone who serves on the commission actually can't run for office in the next 6 years. It would require fair and impartial districts by making it unconstitutional to draw maps that favor any particular political party or individual politician. The map drawing process will be focused on keeping communities together and, of course, abiding by the U.S. Constitution and the Voting Rights Act. It would require the commission to operate under an open and independent process. There are a lot of safeguards for making sure that everything the commission does is in the public eye. Now, the ballot language for this amendment approved by the Ohio Ballot Board has been highly controversial. It, and here I will say confidently, misleadingly, says that issue 1 would require gerrymandering. And in fact, if you see vote no signs, they even say ban gerrymandering on them. I know from my own conversations with voters that people are confused. So it is important to note that the whole point of issue 1 is to take the thumbs off the scales in drawing districts and ensure that the districts are more balanced and that we have a more balanced representation in the General Assembly. We're not going any farther than to say we think the General Assembly ought to more fairly represent the views of the voters of Ohio than it currently does. With regard to the ballot language, we should note we are voting on the amendment, not the summary on the ballot. So whenever you talk to people about this, remind them we're voting on what's in issue 1. I encourage everyone to actually read the proposed amendment. I will warn you, it is very long. Why is that? That is because of the experience we had in 2021, 2022, with all the ways that the politicians who then drew the lines warped the process, and we ended up, despite 2 anti-gerrymandering reforms, we ended up with gerrymandered districts. So, questions have come in about issue 1, and in particular, do we have examples of other states who've passed similar initiatives, and what outcomes did they see? And Jocelyn, would you like to address that one?
I do.
Oh, Dan would. Okay.
I've got family in Michigan, and it was a complete game changer. Michigan was heavily gerrymandered, and about 4 or 5 years ago, they passed something very, very similar to our issue 1, and everything has changed. And representation at the state and federal level in Michigan now represents the makeup of the state, and people are very, very, very happy.
Okay. Thank you for that testimonial from residents of the state up north that we try not to name here in Ohio. Okay. If there are no other questions or comments from our panel, I would like to close by thanking again our co-sponsors, the Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights University Heights chapters of the League of Women Voters. Thank you to the audience for attending, for your participation by asking questions and by caring about the future of Ohio. The video of tonight's session will be posted on the League of Women Voters YouTube channel. You can find the link at lwvgreatercleveland.org. Look for the YouTube icon. For more information on other races that will be on your ballot in November, visit vote411.org, our nonpartisan voter guide, which is a one-stop shop for sounds like an ad, for election-related information. It provides nonpartisan information, including local and statewide issues, candidates, polling locations, election dates and hours, early voting options, and ID requirements. Those are important. If you're not already a league member and you found this event interesting and worthwhile, we encourage you to join us. We're easy to find on the internet under lwvgreatercleveland.org. If you would like to donate to the league to support issue 1, I encourage you go to lwvohio.org and look for the redistricting page. There's a donate button at the bottom of that page. So thank you for attending. And have a pleasant evening.